A little bit. Thanks, Kirby, and thanks everybody for coming. And I also want to thank everybody who's put some time in on this conference. Nancy and Kelly back here. You know, we do one of these conferences in my program once a year, and you don't really realize if you haven't put one on how much work goes into it. And you also don't realize how much work goes into making it look like no work goes into it. And so they've done a really great job here. And the sponsors are always important. And I just wanted to give a quick thank you. I didn't even realize that this keynote is sponsored by Keras Energy. And Dave Keat, the CEO, was one of our very first founding sort of members of the GEM program. And so I want to just let them know how much we appreciate what they're doing as well. You know, as Kirby said, I just want to take a couple minutes here and just to do a kind of quick intro and overview so you know who I am and what I'm doing. GEM is primarily what we do is a master's degree. Think of it like an MBA based, you know, for energy. All of our students, or almost all of our students, come from the energy sector. About half are oil and gas, half are the rest. A big chunk of that group is power and public utilities. About half of them come from Colorado, and the other half come from all over the world. Because the way our program works, you have to be in Denver 4 days each quarter. They do 40 hours of classroom time over a 4-day weekend. Then the rest is all online. So literally, we've had people flying in from China, from the Arabian Gulf. We have several from Africa, South America, all over the place. The master's degree is our core business, but what we also try to do is we try to do some outreach type stuff. And that includes, we run a class, Life Cycle of Oil and Gas. We have some free classes online, Fundamentals of Global Energy Business on Coursera. The Public Utilities is coming out in the fall. But we do a lot of other things. And there's a couple of flyers on the back, if you want to pick them up too, in the back table that will explain some of that. So what am I doing here and why? Okay. I don't come from academia. I come from the industry. I have about 33 years basically in oil and gas, mostly gas around the world. What I've done most of my career is work on human performance. So typically training departments report to me, career planning, career development reports to me, succession planning, strategy execution, change management, all the kind of things that enable people to execute the strategy of a company is what typically falls under me. There's a couple of associate professors at our university in the School of Public Affairs. Their name are Chris Weibel and Tanya Heikkila, and they've been doing work for several years on how government officials in Colorado make decisions regarding energy. It's completely policy neutral. They're not worrying about backing one form or another, but they're trying to analyze what kind of information people have and what dynamics go into those decisions. And part of that project has included, it's not really an oversight group, but a group that just gets together a couple times a year to hear how that research is going and so on. And so out of those meetings, and those meetings, when you look around the table, it'll be about 20 people, and there's oil and gas people in there, there's landowners in there, there's environmentalists in there, government, university, the entire spectrum. And so it struck me going through this process that we spend a lot of time rehashing the same positions and really getting nowhere to discuss and reach consensus on the issues that we need to discuss. Things, you know, around climate, around land use, around different forms of energy. And of the stuff where we spend a lot of time, my sense was that there's a lot more agreement than there is than people realize. And so what I set to do with these principles, what I set out to do is I set out to document some areas where I think the broad majority of people who are involved in the energy industry generally agree, because I want to set a foundation that if we can sort of all look to and say, this is what we agree on, now let's talk about the details where we disagree. So I'm deliberately trying to not be controversial here because I want to try to set something where there's consensus. Still, everybody's not going to agree with everything, but I want to set some middle ground so we can move forward. You know, I go to a lot of conferences and a lot of discussions and so on. And one thing that I do notice is that I think in recent months, even in the last couple of years, along the professional dimension of the energy industry, regardless, we're talking wind people, solar people, oil and gas, nuclear, everybody, but the professionals in the industry. To me, I sense a growing consensus around key issues with the industry. On the oil and gas and the fossil fuel side, I sense a consensus that, there are different degrees, but we have to manage carbon, we have to manage emissions, we have to manage methane. You heard a lot of the methane rules and things this morning. Colorado's a leader in that. At the same time, with the wind and the solar and the renewables people, there's I think a really solid recognition at this point that, we're not going to have a wind and solar universe in the next 20 years. We're going to have a significant proportion of our energy demands met by fossil fuels for at least another generation. 50 years, if you look 50 years forward, you still have a high proportion. And so the consensus is emerging that we're not going to try to wipe each other out. What we got to do is we just got to manage things better. That hasn't necessarily reached the political universe yet, the general public. I mean, you still have a lot of controversy, but in the professional side of the industry, I think there's a lot of consensus. So I got 10 principles, and I'm going to go through them here fairly quickly for you, and then we'll have time for some Q&A. They kind of go from general to specific and hopefully tell a little bit of a story. And the first one is this: energy is crucial. Energy is fundamental to all human life and well-being. You can't do anything without energy at all, okay? Remember that energy, if you go back to high school physics, whatever, energy is the capacity to do work. Without it, you can't do any work. And that means, you can't get up, you can't go to the grocery store without it, okay? This graph shows energy consumption versus gross domestic product per capita in a number of countries around the world. And you see it's basically a perfect correlation. The more energy that a country uses, the higher their GDP. There's some causality questions about that, which causes which. Is it the GDP that causes the energy use, or the energy use causes GDP? But the point is that they travel together. This is a historical view. And this is just the U.S. going back to 1843. But it shows a couple of things here, okay? First of all, you see here that the GDP line is continually going up, and so is the energy use. You have several different events here. You see the beginning of the Industrial Revolution right there. That's where you start to see coal being important. This is in the early 1800s. This isn't exactly to scale, by the way. If you go prior to, I think, 1910, it's a different scale. So this slope actually tails out a lot more than that. Here you start to see, about the turn of the 20th century, automobiles and electrification coming in. Now you're going to start to see the dawn of petroleum coming in. Here you got World War II, huge jump in energy use, and then setting the foundation for, for the post-war era and for the future. Another thing to think about with this, a friend of mine, Julio Friedman from the Livermore National Laboratory, he makes the point, and this really got to me when I heard him say this: we've never used less of any energy source ever. Once it gets into the energy mix, all it does is grow. And you can even see that on this. Even wood, is still higher here than it is there. And so as we think about the energy future and growing demand for energy, we have to think about how we're going to mix our energy sources into that. Here's one more piece on this, and this is a little bit different take. This one is quality of life versus energy use. And quality of life, I used an index, the United Nations Human Development Index, and it takes into account three things: lifespan and health, education and learning, and then overall standard of living. So it's not necessarily a perfect correlation to quality of life. Different people have different ideas about that, but it's still generally pretty reasonable. And so what you see here is that after about 100 million BTU per person per year, the benefit of increasing energy use starts to level off. And as you use more and more energy, you get less and less quality of life from it. Now, it's not perfect because, like some of these countries, Iceland, Norway, US and Canada, you need more heating. It doesn't show up as a labeled country out here, but Qatar is one of these where they're constantly doing cooling. You got driving distances. It's not perfect correlation, but the general idea that there is some point where continued use of energy doesn't necessarily add more quality of life, and that drives to energy efficiency, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So that's the first principle. Second one is energy technology. And what I'm saying here is energy technology is always evolving, and there is no endpoint to energy technology. This graph up here is a really interesting graph. It's done by a professor at the University of Manitoba named Václav Smil. And if you have a chance to look him up, you should. Vaclavsmil is his name, and he's actually cited as Bill Gates' favorite author. But the point of this one is that the time to adoption and the time to dominance for any fuel, it's continually a lowering slope, which means that each one takes longer than the one before it to become dominant. And the reason for that is because of existing infrastructure changes, different kinds of work that are being done. But what we have to keep in mind as we look at the future in energy technology is that the newest, most advanced energy technology is not the same as the most dominant energy technology, and the time lag between those is significant. So what you see on the horizon coming will take longer to really become part of the energy mix than what already exists. So that's important for planning. So you see that even, you know, if you look back to the 19th century, which is the age of coal, wood was still the dominant, or biomass in general was still dominant. 20th century, the age of oil, but coal actually supplied more of our energy than oil did. So it takes time for this to happen. So the principle that I want to talk about there is that, you know, there's all kinds of technology on the horizon. There's driverless cars, there's wave technology, those giant windmills, small nuclear reactors. This is a process called the alum process, which is just being experimented with right now, which is a coal-based process where they put carbon capture is incorporated in the combustion rather than in a scrubber on top of the plant, so it becomes part of the actual process of burning coal. There's a plant Exelon is trying to do right now that puts that together. Hydrogen fuel cells. I know a guy, I met a guy from Southern California, Edison, who's working on a project of power to gas. Okay, so not gas to power, but power to gas. What they're doing is they're working in times when there's excess solar and wind and using that power to create hydrogen. Then that hydrogen is stored and they burn it later. And when you burn hydrogen, of course, all you get is steam, right? So there's nothing that comes with that. Then you got nuclear fusion, you know, but the point is we don't know what the next step of technology is going to be. In the early 1900s, when we were making the transition to oil, nobody even thought about nuclear, right? When we were making the transition to nuclear in the mid 20th century, nobody was thinking about wind and solar as true sets of sources of power. So whatever's out there 50 years from now, there's a good chance we haven't even thought of it yet. Okay, so what we don't want to do as a society is make a commitment or pick winners. What we do want to do is create an environment that lets new technologies grow and take root. And those are two different things. So, third principle is that any production and use of energy in any form, whether it's fossil fuels, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, always has some impact on the environment. That environmental impact is an economic cost that's associated with that, and it's important that we take into account those costs and deal with those costs when we're making our energy decisions. So, I mean, here's a wind farm, but you know, everybody thinks of wind as being, you know, clean and no impact on the environment, but it kills thousands of birds. There's a manufacturing process that creates the wind turbines, that creates solar panels, that uses rare earths, uses all kinds of things. Everything has some impact. We have to know what those are. Right now, the most dominant one, as we all know, is climate and carbon. This is a picture I took in January of 2015, and you cannot see really what that is. That's the Three Gorges Dam in China. That's the biggest source of carbon-free energy on the planet. You can't see it from 200 yards away because of the haze that's drifting down from Beijing. So, you know, it is an important issue. There's a lot of disagreement and a lot of controversy around just how important carbon is, how important climate change is. Some science points one way, some science points another way. My thinking on this is this. Climate is changing. Now, there's different discussions of why. There's different discussions how much human activity affects that. My feeling is that I don't know the answer to how much human activity affects that, but I do feel pretty confident that it affects it at least a little bit. So therefore, the way I take into that as a matter of thinking is that the less greenhouse gas we put in the atmosphere, the better the idea is. Doesn't mean we need to slam on the brakes on everything. We've already talked about we're certainly not getting rid of coal, oil, natural gas in the next 50 years, but we do have to be able to manage what those effects from those fuels are as we look at the future. Anybody know what this is? This is the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, right there. This is an example of energy poverty affecting environment, which then in turn affects energy poverty. In Haiti, they've cut down all the forests because they're burning wood, because they don't have other sources of electricity. Dominican Republic, it's all green. This is sucking up carbon dioxide, right? This is forest. This is not. Well, it is, but not as much. So something to think about, and we'll talk about energy poverty in just a minute. Fourth principle is energy efficiency. And this is that energy has value and must be used efficiently. If you look, one of the ways that I like to try to understand the energy industry is, all the time we always start with our primary energy sources as the way we think about the industry, and we don't think about the demand side, how it's actually used, right? So if you look over on the right, or even in the middle, you see that most energy gets used for primarily two things. One is transportation, the other is electricity generation, and then there's other industrial and commercial uses as well. Oil is basically all transportation, some feedstocks and things like that for industry. Electricity basically uses everything else, all the renewables, gas, coal, everything, with some gas being used for other residential purposes and so on. But what's important here is this rejected energy. Basically 60% of the energy we produce does no work. And if we talked about energy being the capacity to do work, we have to think about that 60% of energy that we create, and sometimes it's lost, it's usually lost in two different areas. One is because it's being used for electricity or transportation, the machinery that we use to convert primary energy either into electric power or into motion is just not as efficient as it possibly could be. You have line loss and electrical generation and all kinds of things. That, to me, is as much of a source of energy as new deposits of coal or oil or solar farms, because we've already paid for it once. We paid to produce it in both economic and environmental terms. We should be looking at, how do we harvest it better? And this is something that all of us can do. I mean, even the insulation on your house or your windows, everything, all that causes energy to be created that doesn't really deliver the benefit that energy could provide us. Principle 5, energy poverty. Probably most people have seen this slide right here. This is a composite photo of the world at night, and you can see where it's lit and where it's not lit, where there's access to electricity. But around the world there are more than 1 billion people, more than 1/7 of the population, who have no access to electricity, and there's another 1 billion or 1.5 billion beyond that who don't have access to safe cooking fuels or safe environments. So look at this next slide. This comes from the World Health Organization, and overlay those two. The areas that are dark here are areas with high rates of death from indoor air pollution, because people don't have electricity, they don't have power, they're in their homes, they're burning wood, they're burning dung, even burning kerosene, and several million people a year die because of indoor air pollution. There's other aspects to this problem. Somebody in one of the earlier panels was talking about demand for energy over the next 50 years coming essentially from the developing world. This is a graph that shows that. The OECD countries, that's Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that's basically North America, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. It's what we think of as the developed world. And you can see that from now up until 2035, the demand growth for energy is very flat. Main reason for this is that energy efficiency is expected to be taking hold in these countries. We are starting now to see, I showed you in the very beginning the graph with the relationship between GDP and energy consumption. We're starting to see the beginnings of a decoupling there, where we're starting to see in the developing countries where there's economic growth that doesn't include the same corresponding growth in energy use, and that's due to energy efficiency. But the effects of energy poverty and coming out of energy poverty as China, India, and other countries, especially some of the African countries, emerge into the global middle class, is that the demand for energy growth between now and 2035 is the increase is almost all here. And so this is something that we need to think about from a geopolitical point of view. First of all, I mean, to me, it's a moral issue that people shouldn't be in their houses breathing wood or having to spend 6 hours a day carrying sticks on their head rather than being able to have industries or functioning economy. But it's also geopolitically, it's a source of instability. It contributes to terrorism. It contributes to the migration that you're seeing coming into Europe and all those kind of things. It's a problem that will demand to be solved. The UN is working on an initiative called the Sustainable Energy for All, SE for All, and you can look it up on the UN website, where from 2014 to 2024 they have 3 major energy imperatives. One is to get rid of indoor air pollution. Hold on. Somewhere I had these written down, but I can remember them anyway. It's to eliminate energy poverty, get everybody access to energy, to double the rate of energy efficiency, an improvement in energy efficiency, and to double the share of renewables in the overall energy mix. Now, the thing to keep in mind there is this. This is from the International Energy Agency, and it only shows electrical generation. It doesn't show transportation. But from 2013 to 2040, if you double the renewables, because of the demand growth that's taken place in the developing world, what you're doing essentially is you're moving from 12% or maybe less, 8 or 9% to 15, 16%. And still 85% of the world's energy has to come from the sources we've been using all along, whether it's fossil fuels, nuclear, hydroelectric, whatever those are. And with the growth in demand, it means that the principle of we never use less of anything ever still holds. Even if coal or oil or gas are not as big of a proportionate number of the energy use around the world, in absolute terms, they still grow. And so we have to keep those things into account. Principle number 6, and this is a little bit newer. And the principle here is that there are multiple stakeholders in the production and use of energy in any form, and all of them will assert their interests. And we see that right here in Colorado right now. Stakeholders are very diverse. I like to kind of divide them into 2 classifications. One is global. So as a global stakeholder, it really includes everybody. We use energy, we deal with the climate, but we don't have particularly focused effects on energy policy or what we do. But then you have local stakeholders as well, and a lot of people in this room are local stakeholders. You either have a job in the energy industry, you have an oil well near your house, like that. You have a wind farm in your backyard, anything like that, but where the effects of energy production and use are personal, and these are the groups who will act more strongly to affect policy. So one of the things that we do and that we teach in our political risk and stakeholder analysis is that there are really 2 dimensions to stakeholder involvement. One is power. How much do they have the capability to affect decision making? The other is motivation. What's their level of interest? What's their propensity to act? Where you have high power, high motivation, you're going to have stakeholder action. And for all the government officials here in the room, you play a critical role here, and it's important that you understand and take that role seriously about how you manage that stakeholder interaction and how you lead and influence that stakeholder interaction in your communities. From the industry side, it's equally important because we're reaching a time when we can't work without having to manage stakeholders. And so what we have to do, all of us, is decide whether we want this or whether we want that, and how do we manage this. Principle 7, energy profitability. And here, this is kind of the flip side of some of the stakeholder stuff. And what I've written here for the principle is that energy producers and suppliers have the right to a fair profit that takes into account investment, innovation, effort, operational effectiveness, and business and technological risk. So businesses make investments, they take risks, and without profitability, they won't continue to do that. The energy industry won't continue to develop, it won't continue to move if companies can't be profitable. And as we regulate companies, as we deal with companies and manage companies, we have to remember that. It doesn't mean that every company in the energy industry has an automatic right to make a profit. You got to do it right, right? And that changes over time by what society demands. There was a time when whale oil was very profitable. We don't see a lot of whale oil anymore, right? Times change, technology change, expectations change. The industry has to change with it. It has to move along, manage the stakeholders, manage political risk, all the things that it has to do. But at the end of the day, when you've got investments of, $1,500 billion, $1.5 trillion a year, if that investment is expected to continue, then people have to be able to make a profit from it. Nobody's going to do this for free. That's a platform in the North Sea, by the way. So principle 8, sustainability. We look at 3 different things for sustainability. First is economically sound. The business has to be economically sound. We just talked about that. We've talked about all these now over the last couple of principles. Second is it has to be environmentally sound. Third is it has to be socially sound. And that's where you start to achieve balance. And that's where, as leaders in the energy industry, whether we're in a company, whether we're in a university like I am, whether we're in a community, we have to work together to try to create that balance. And, the regulatory environment, I want to do a quick shout out to my friend Matt Lepore over here with COGCC, but the regulatory environment in general, in my mind, plays the crucial role in maintaining that balance and balancing those 3 different imperatives so that none of them get too far out of alignment with the others. Principle 9, energy security. And here, what I'm saying is that countries, communities, whatever, because energy is fundamental to everything that they do, will work to secure their energy supplies and sometimes work to undermine the energy supplies of others. This map here shows world choke points for oil. Geopolitically right now, for the last 100 years, oil really has been the story. Before that, it was coal. But other forms of energy tend to have local markets, so they don't have the same geopolitical significance as oil. Oil, in a lot of ways, actually defined the 20th century, if you think about it from a geopolitical standpoint. You had the build-up to empire following World War I. You had all of the strategic efforts in World War II to deal with energy. I mean, World War II in the Pacific actually largely was a result of oil because the U.S. had cut off Japan's access to oil supplies in Indonesia. You have the U.S. government toppling the Mossadegh regime in Iran in the early 50s, and where that led to collapse of the USSR in the 80s because the oil price went down largely. You saw the graph earlier about oil in the 80s. A lot of that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is important stuff, and it drives policy. The U.S. Navy spends about $85 billion a year keeping these choke points open. But the alternative, if the U.S. Navy stops keeping that open, the next thing is this is vital energy for China, then the China's got to develop a blue water Navy. So the question is, do you want to spend money in the U.S. Navy or do you want a blue water Chinese Navy? Take your pick. Last one is that energy is a force for good. And there's really interesting work being done by a couple of different groups out of the UK. The one's called Molten Consulting, the other's called Naked Leader. And they did a video. I was thinking about showing it, but I think we're getting tight on time, so I probably won't. But if you get a chance to Google one of those and go look at their video on YouTube, you should. And they have a white paper you can download as well. But here's the point of this. We've established that we can't do anything without energy. We've established that we have to manage different stakeholder groups and different sustainability, different forms of sustainability to produce and deliver energy. What we haven't talked about is that the energy industry itself and the people who work in and around it are people in this room, people all across the state, and every one of them every single day goes into work wanting to do the best that they can do. Nobody's going into work wanting to destroy the environment. Nobody's going into work wanting to dump oil in the Gulf of Mexico. Accidents happen, but if you work in this industry, what you have to realize is that given the complexity and the hazard associated with producing coal, oil and gas, anything out of the ground and converting it into a usable form, it's a miracle that we don't have more accidents than we do because of the way the energy industry is effectively managed. There's not a single company that I've ever dealt with that doesn't legitimately cite safety and operational effectiveness as their major concerns. And these are things that have become not just compliance issues, they've become core values across the industry. And too often the industry gets demonized as being, land grabbers or, profiteers and so on. And, we already talked about, you got to have profits, but it's good people doing good work, and we need to recognize that. And as leaders, thought leaders around the state, we need to help drive that perception and that understanding, because without the energy industry, nobody's doing anything. So that's basically my presentation. We've got, I guess, about 10 minutes for questions, comments. Yep.
How do we protect new energy technology? Here. All right, thanks. Yeah. So, how do we protect new energy technologies against the entrance of the entrenched stakeholders in the industry? We have so much money, and we, as an American economy, we also get so much tax revenue from all the energy production. How do we balance stepping forward into newer, cheaper technologies that might that come out of the woodwork here soon, that might not be invented now, but might be invented in the near future, that could make our previous technologies and infrastructure obsolete? How do we balance these steps moving forward with the current stakeholders in the industry here?
Well, yeah, I think part of it is just, we have here in Colorado, if you ever have a chance to go to Golden and go visit NREL, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, it's really worth visiting. But there's a whole series of primary research organizations across the country that do different kinds of things and invent a lot of this technology. A lot of that is done with grants, a lot of it's done with government subsidies and so on. So there has to be some level of spending there. Luckily, when you go back to the basic principle that energy is the capacity to do work, different forms of energy are actually more suitable for different kinds of work. I mean, nobody uses oil to create electric power anymore. They did, but they don't anymore. It's really just a transportation fuel, or it's a feedstock. Nobody's using solar to run a car. I mean, they do it to create electricity and use that to run a car, but they don't, you don't see a car with solar panels on it. So partly it's a matter of evolving different technologies that are suited to different kinds of work. But I think partly it's just kind of not hammering on them too soon to turn around and be profitable and to let them grow. If you go back, the first steam engines, the ones that first came on in the early 1700s, I think the first steam engine was 6 horsepower. So a team of 6 horses did as much work as that steam engine did, and I'm sure they were a lot cheaper, but it was able to grow. So technologies, even though they're clunky, even though they don't do what you want them to do when they first come around, they get better. I mean, think of the first cars, the Model Ts and stuff, and what it took to keep those things on the road compared to what we have now. So.
I have a question about emerging technologies or stifled technologies, and if part of that is rare earth minerals that are valuable to us now, that they say are in tailings piles, hard rock mines all over the West. And the other side of that is thorium is a byproduct of rare earth tailings. And have you heard of thorium fluoride reactors?
Yeah, I have. Honestly, that's not something I have a lot of expertise in. What I read and what I hear is that that sounds like very much the wave of the future for nuclear because it's more stable and doesn't have the same, waste issues and so on. But I can't claim a lot of expertise. That's pretty esoteric for me. I'm a business guy, not a technology guy.
Thank you.
Okay. Yep. Oh. We got a microphone back here. Let's go with the microphone and then.
I was just curious. It looked like solar wasn't predicted as a very big contributor in the future, and I'm just curious if there's a reason why.
I think it is in absolute terms. I think the expectation is a lot of growth for solar. I think the reason why those graphs and the reason I use those graphs is more, it's not so much a function that solar or wind aren't going to grow, because I believe they clearly are going to grow. But it's there to show the difference between the overall demand and the growth of the overall demand and those technologies growing and becoming part of that demand. Because, like I say, even if wind and solar triple between now and 2040, they're going to 15, maybe 20% of the overall energy mix. And the graph I showed you was electricity, and so that's where they exist, and so they're even bigger. And when you factor in transportation, unless we were to go 100% to electric cars, which isn't going to happen in that time frame, it's even a smaller proportion. So my point there is that we do have to keep making them better. They're working right now in China. I read this last week that they developed a new solar film that will create electricity when it rains, because the film is sensitive to ionic changes in the raindrops, because the raindrops aren't pure water. They have different ions in them. And so when the water hits the film, it becomes electrically charged and creates current. So, who knows where these things are going to go, right?
Thank you for the presentation and the principles. I really enjoyed seeing those. What I'm wondering, you had just mentioned about new technologies are often clunky and need time to develop and become profitable. But at a certain level, at least the headlines seem to suggest that some of the electric and energy industries are really trying to suppress those new technologies, particularly the transmission issue and rooftop solar and charging back, or at the federal level constantly fighting any of the tax credits for those new energy technologies. Is it really something that everyone's trying to grow the industry, or are people trying to just suppress those to hold market share?
Yes.
Yes.
You got all sides of that. Specifically with the utilities and the rooftop solar. There are issues there. Basically, that becomes an issue of amortizing the cost of the grid. There's billions of dollars of investment in the electrical grid that, as market share starts to increase for rooftop solar, and people aren't using that grid, then the cost of the grid gets continually more concentrated on everybody else, which is actually regressive, because if you figure that it's generally wealthier people putting rooftop solar, then it's poorer people who are stuck paying the cost of the grid, whose electricity rates go up because it's all regulated utility, right? So that's part of that controversy, and they have to figure out some way to solve that, where we can manage to pay for the infrastructure that we need, because even the houses that are on solar, they still need the grid, because when it's dark, when there's no power, whatever, they're taking power in. So somehow that's got to be done. There's different ideologies, to me, unfortunately, that impact energy that have nothing to do with energy. If you come to Washington or whatever, and you just don't believe that anything should be subsidized ever, well, you're not going to subsidize new energy technologies, right? My preference, if you're coming from the climate side, if you think that you know, at all costs, oil and gas must stay in the ground, you're not going to be looking to help carbon capture or any of the things that enable us to use those resources. So, you know, what I try to advocate, and what I hope we can get a lot of people advocating, is let's look at these different issues for what they are and discuss them for what they are, not as representative of some bigger ideology that we're trying to drive, because that's where we reach controversies that we can't resolve. Because we're not really talking about the question we're talking about. We're talking about some other question, but not acknowledging it. All right. Thank you.